Hello, everyone. So today we're going to take a brief look at the timeline of painting. We've already looked at prehistoric examples such as African rock paintings and ancient paintings like Egyptian books of the dead. But painting has been a means of expression for humans since prehistoric times, and it's still a really primary form of art making today. And to best understand where we are now, we first need to take a look at how we got here. So beginning with medieval art, this is also considered art of the Middle Ages, which commonly depicted religious scenes and themes. Here are two examples, one by Cimabue and the other by Giotto. They show the exact same subject matter, a very common depiction, which is Madonna holding the Christ child surrounded by angels. These paintings are egg tempera on wood. This type of paint dries really quickly, so it's not good for blending. In addition, these are massive panels. They were meant to be displayed in a church so that the whole room could see them. The gold leaf that you see here is ornamental, but it's also symbolic. It was meant to reflect the light of heaven. The spaces that these figures occupy are not really earthly, but they're meant to be seen in a heavenly realm. So there's a few differences that we can notice in these paintings, even though they depict the same subject matter. In Giotto's painting, the painting on the right, Madonna is physically much larger. She takes up more space, she's sturdier, her body doesn't appear as fragile. There's also a difference in the way that her drapery is handled. It's a bit more naturalistic. In addition, there's a difference in the way that the angels are depicted. In the Cimabue painting, the one on the left, they're stacked on top of one another and all represented very similarly. But in Giotto's painting on the right, they're shown a little more in perspective. So even if that means that he has to obscure the view of some of the angels that are further back, it gives a more realistic representation of perspective as seen from a front-facing viewer. We then move to the Proto-Renaissance, which is essentially pre-Renaissance. This movement focused on figurative realism, and there were also a lot of innovations with perspective. So this is the interior of the Arena Chapel in Italy. It was commissioned by the Scrovegni family, and the entire interior was painted in fresco by Giotto. Most of these frescoes are narrative scenes, but in between them, he employed this trompe-l'oeil effect, which means an effect that fools the eye. So it looks actually like there's marble stone inlaid in between these scenes, but really it's just painting. There's 3 registers of paintings that all tell the story of Christ's life. So here is one that shows the lamentation scene, which is the scene after Christ has been taken down from the cross and he's being mourned by his family and his followers. We see his mother, Mary, holding his dead body in her lap, which is an incredibly sad image, but it's also a very modern one. The idea of showing Christ as dead, as human, is modern. Notice how Giotto has drawn our eye to Christ, even though he has moved him out of the center of the painting. By using the diagonal line of the wall, he leads our eye directly to Christ down in the left corner. In addition, look at their body language, especially the body language of Mary. She's distraught. She's pleading with her son to wake up. She twists her body and props him up on her knee. Her face looks like it's full of pain. She's very, very human here. There's also all of these angels. They're grieving in their own unique ways as well. You can see them kind of with their hands on their faces, pulling their hair. They're distraught. They don't know what to do. These 2 figures that you see in the foreground, one in the green and one in the kind of tan, they're depicted in a very unique way. We don't know who they are because we can't see their faces. This is new. Giotto is okay with using figures that add nothing to the narrative, as he's using them more as framing devices for Christ and Mary. So they're looking at Christ in the same direction that we would be looking at Christ, which kind of allows us to associate ourselves as being in this scene. Here's another chapel completely filled with fresco paintings, minus that one tempera painting that's in the middle. In the upper left is a painting by Masaccio. It's a story from the New Testament. There is a tax collector. He is in the foreground here in orange with his back to us. He's approaching Christ and his apostles, trying to collect money, but they don't have any money because they've renounced all of their earthly possessions. So Christ is telling St. Peter, who you can see in the far square on the left in blue and orange, I'm sorry, not in the square on the left, directly to the left of Christ, to go get money from the Sea of Galilee, from the mouth of a fish. This is a miracle that Christ performed, where a fish comes up with the money in its mouth for St. Peter. So we see him in this central panel asking St. Peter to go to the sea and get that money. And in this same painting, we see Peter in the sea retrieving that money on the left. Then in the right, we see St. Peter giving the money that he's retrieved to the tax collector. So it's an idea of a continuous narrative. There's multiple scenes going on in this one depiction. It's also a great example of linear perspective. So this idea of how we depict a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. Christ's head, we see here, is the vanishing point. So it places him at the center and is the main focal point. But if we follow all of the orthogonals, these diagonal lines, they lead us to that vanishing focal point. There's also a sense of atmospheric perspective. St. Peter's in the background on the left. There's mountains behind the apostles and Christ, which show the illusion of space. It's a believable landscape, right? There's less focus the further away that we are. The light is hitting them from the right, so you can see the cast shadows of the figures. And the light in the chapel comes in from the right as well, where this is actually located. So that adds to the realistic nature of the image. Moving forward into the early Renaissance, we see a bit more lifelike painting in regard to posing and movement. This is a very famous example you might be familiar with, Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. It's actually almost life-size, this fully nude female. She's not religious subject matter, but she's mythological. This combination is new for the Renaissance. She covers her body similarly to the way that we saw Eve covering hers in depictions of Adam and Eve, but hers is a gesture of modesty, not of shame. The meaning behind this painting is not known, but it's viewed as a celebration of beauty and love. So here Venus is born from the sea as a fully grown woman. She's blown by the west wind, Zephyr, and this painting reads as really flat though. There's a few reasons why that is. The figures are all the same size, they're all shown on the same plane, and they stand so strangely, unnaturally. You couldn't really repeat this gesture of Venus comfortably. You would fall over. It's not feasible. They're not grounded. If you look at the woman on the right, the way that she is standing is not realistic. She's a bit more in the foreground than Venus is, but they're depicted as the same size. All of the figures are the exact same size despite their positioning. So the Northern Renaissance and Flemish artists were a little unique to the early Renaissance period. There's three key differences from Italian Renaissance painters. In Northern Renaissance and Flemish paintings, they used oil paint versus fresco and tempera. So this allowed them to use thick layers and rich color, as well as intricate and realistic detail. So their art was viewed as a devotional action. It was all under God. They also showed genre scenes and symbolism. Genre scenes are scenes from everyday life. The figures also typically have pale skin and big heads, and there's not really a focus on perfection, but on depicting things in minute detail. These paintings are densely packed with objects and items connected to theology. So a few differences between tempera and oil painting. Tempera paintings, which are those that you'd seen in the previous slides, that's a paint that consists of egg combined with a wet paste of ground pigment. So it dries very quickly, it's very difficult to blend, but it does have this velvety sheen. So there's a high-keyed color, sharp light, and matte dullness. Oil painting, however, as you are probably familiar with, allows for more transparent glazes over layer after layer. You can have these translucent layers over something like maybe a carefully planned drawing, and it gives an illusion of glowing light or smokiness if you'd like. It dries more slowly, which allows for reworking. This is the Marode altarpiece shown open, which is a triptych, but it's all on one panel. And this is an example that I was talking about of art as a devotional act. So this particular piece was meant to be hung in the house for someone's private devotion. It displays biblical scenes, but the scenes take place in a normal Flemish house. So they're not concerned with 3D space or perspective, but again, on really focusing on all of those small, fine details. Here's a better view of the piece opened up. You can see it's not that big. If you look at the dimensions here, it's only 2 feet by almost 3 feet wide for each wing. So a total of 2 feet tall by about 11 inches wide. And as well. So this really shows what oil paint can do. We can see these sharp folds that were characteristic of the Northern Renaissance, this focus on drapery as well as texture of the fabric. The central panel here depicts the Annunciation, so it's an event that would have taken place about 1500 years before this painting was actually created. It shows the Archangel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary. They're sitting inside of a typical 15th century Northern European home, which puts the Annunciation in a modern context. This panel depicts the donors and the commissioners of this painting, who are kneeling by this door. They're in a walled-in courtyard, and I want you to look at the amount of detail. That is what separates the Northern Renaissance from the Italian Renaissance. Here, Campin is interested in every nut and bolt and flower. You can see in the zoomed-in image here the birds shown on the ledge. In the far right panel, we see Joseph, who is Mary's husband, and he's in his workshop. When we zoom in even further, you can see the mouse trap on his window. And that shows that that's something he's creating that he's selling out to the people on the street. There's just as much attention given to the scene outside of those people on the street as there is to Joseph inside of his workshop. Moving forward into the High Renaissance, you'll see paintings such as this that you're very familiar with, The Last Supper by Da Vinci. So this painting depicts the moment after Jesus tells his disciples that one of them is going to betray them, and it shows their reactions. So Christ is the psychological focus as well as the focal point of all of these converging lines. It's a very unified composition. There aren't actually any halos, but Christ's body forms this kind of triangle, and the window around him forms a type of halo around him. So the painting actually exists in a refectory where monks eat their meals. So again, it's depicting a Last Supper scene, a scene of holy people sharing meals, and the painting actually lives in a place where holy people eat their meals. So it's again bringing in that sense of realism. Raphael's philosophy, School of Athens, exists in a room that was originally a library in the Vatican. So it shows again linear perspective and that illusion of space. In the middle are Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And this is really an image of sharing knowledge and the history of the accumulation of knowledge. Raphael is on the right. Raphael's the artist who painted this painting, and he's shown on the right staring straight at us. He's in the black cap by the right pillar. You can just see his face kind of poking out. So he's putting himself as the artist among some of the greatest thinkers in history. So it really gives credit to this notion of the artist as an intellectual instead of just as a craftsman. Here is Michelangelo's The Last Judgment from the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. And this is a scene from the New Testament, from the book of Revelation. Christ is at the center here with the Virgin Mary. In the bottom right are the damned, on the bottom left are the blessed, and it shows Christ as the judge of these people who's determining their fate. So below him, there's angels who are blowing their trumpets. They're awakening the dead from their graves. And Michelangelo really is best known for these powerful figures. So look at his handling of the bodies of these people. On the bottom left, the dead souls are actually leaving their bodies. You can see that kind of haziness coming up out of their forms. And angels are pulling some of them up to the heavens. But on the bottom right, people are being dragged to hell by demons and they're being bitten by snakes. Northern European Renaissance, we're going to look at Hieronymus Bosch, who's one of the most famous Netherlandish painters at the turn of the 16th century. This triptych, called The Garden of Earthly Delights, was commissioned by Count Hendrik III of Nassau, so he was an aristocrat, and this was commissioned for his home. In the leftmost panel, we see God introducing Adam and Eve, presumably in the Garden of Eden, and they're surrounded by this array of fanciful and unusual animals. Then in the middle scene, things start to get a little weird. There's the many groups of nude people, there's fruit everywhere symbolizing fertility, and it's really about pleasure and sexuality. As we move toward the rightmost panel, we are in hell, maybe because we experience too much pleasure and sexuality in the middle panel, but there's all kinds of beastly creatures and torture taking place. We see fire and knives and sharp objects piercing flesh. There's bandages and limp bodies. So still, with this Netherlandish painting, there's a great amount of detail and a variety of scenes that can really keep the viewer's attention and have them think about what is the artist trying to say here. Moving forward into mannerism, this is a more artificial, less naturalistic, and exaggerated form of painting. So in Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck, we see not the ideal naturalism of the High Renaissance, but more of an elegant exaggeration to the body. So look at the Christ child's massive body in comparison to Madonna's tiny little head and her long neck. She has these huge hips, but she has a very small foot. The proportions are off. There's also a tiny little prophet in the bottom right, but how far away would he have to have been to be that small if he was shown an accurate perspective? The Baroque period was one of drama and emotional intensity, very realistic, not idealized. The scenes often showcased a sense of intimacy. So in Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, there's something happening. It doesn't feel so posed. It's active, right? We're in the middle of a scene of something unfolding. We're witnessing a moment in time, and these are usually active and dramatic moments. So in this scene, the Calling of St. Matthew, Christ, on the far right, has walked into this room to call upon St. Matthew, to follow him. Christ is not idealized. He looks like this completely normal guy in a bar. It's a contemporary environment. And this idea of the calling of St. Matthew has been taken very literally here. Christ is actually pointing at St. Matthew. Then you see St. Matthew in the middle of the table pointing to himself saying, "Who? Me?" It's this room full of tax collectors, because that's what Matthew was, and he's pointing to himself, asking Christ, "Are you talking to me and that you came into this bar that I'm hanging out with and you're calling upon me to follow you?" Artemisia Gentileschi was a follower of Caravaggio and a very important female artist. You can see kind of the influence that he had on her with this dark background and illuminated foreground. But in this painting, the self-portrait is the allegory of painting. The artist paints herself in this very active gesture, right? She's not looking at the audience. She's not posed. She's doing what she does. She's painting. She's painting a painting of herself painting. Here's Rembrandt's The Night Watch, and again, it's a sense of intimacy here. We're invited into this space. Rembrandt guides our attention through these intense highlights that focus on the central figures. Rococo is really kind of its own thing. It can be described as very graceful, gentle, dreamlike, sometimes sensual, and really very frivolous. In Fragonard's The Swing, we see a woman being pushed on a swing by an older gentleman, and her kind of presumed lover is hiding in the bushes in the foreground. The putti, that's the small cherubs, on the left, raises his hand to say shh, like he knows that her lover is hiding to not tell her husband that is pushing her. So it's not really in a forest, it's behind a villa or a palace that has been overgrown. Here's Watteau's Mezzotin. We see him playing his guitar in these satin clothes in the woods as he gazes longingly into space, which is not a very realistic scene, right? If you were in the woods, that's likely not what you would be wearing. Then we see Thomas Gainsborough, the blue boy, who's this kind of little boy wearing these fancy pants, is very fluffy and sweet and frivolous, but again, he's in nature and he's a child. As a child in nature is likely maybe playing or exploring, and they wouldn't be wearing these very immaculate, high-end pieces of clothing. This look was recently adopted by Quentin Tarantino in the film Django Unchained. Neoclassic paintings are heroic. They focus on storytelling, they're very clean and polished. Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii is what we call a history painting. So David felt that subject matter should have a moral. This is a story from pre-Republican Rome in which the cities of Rome and Alba were at war. Instead of having hundreds or even thousands of people die in a war, each city sent 3 brothers to fight. So Rome sent the Horatii brothers, who are pictured here, and Alba sent the Curatii brothers. The women in the background represent women who are married to both the Horatii and the Curatii. So this war is going to tear these women apart no matter what happens. This painting is really about patriotism and sacrifice. It places courage and loyalty above things like emotion, love, and sorrow. Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe shows this scene of martyrdom, right? General Wolfe is dying at the moment of victory. He just conquered Quebec. But this is a very peaceful scene. This man is actively dying, but everyone is surrounding him in a gentle way in kind of these beautiful poses, witnessing what's happening very peacefully. They're not freaking out. It's not dramatic. It's just kind of relaxed, and the way that the light shines on him and highlights him in this act of his final breaths is really breathtaking. Jacques-Louis David, Death of Marat, was painted during the French Revolution. So it depicts a contemporary event. It's not a history painting like the Oath of the Horatii, but it portrays a martyr to the French Revolution. Charlotte Corday, who was a believer in the monarchy, this woman went to see Marat and she murdered him in his bathtub. So the knife that she used, you can see on the floor in the bottom left, and the letter that she used to get in to see him, kind of how she enticed him to let her in, is what he's holding as he bleeds out in his tub. So the pose here is similar to that of Christ in the Pieta. Again, it's this notion of martyrdom. But this was another point of the revolution, to secularize society and further remove it from the church. In the Romantic period, there's more of a focus on emotions. So this is Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. The title refers to a ship called the Medusa, which had about 400 people on board and was setting out to reclaim Senegal from the British. The ship wrecked in the open ocean, and there weren't enough lifeboats, so one of the carpenters on board was asked to build a makeshift raft for those who couldn't fit in the lifeboats. The raft was supposed to be towed by the lifeboats, but it was slowing them down, so they cut ties with it and let it drift out into the open ocean. The more important people were in the lifeboats, and the raft held people like settlers and soldiers. So there's a horrific events taking place on this raft. There's starvation, murder, even cannibalism. The artist interviewed survivors. This is something that actually happened. He also built a model of the raft in his studio and even got some body parts from the morgue so that he could accurately depict the decaying remains. So he's making a political statement to the king, who appointed the captain and was kind of incompetent, saying, "You failed. Look what you did." In Romanticism, we see the use of diagonals to convey energy and drama. So there's this intense foreshortening here. Romanticism is about the human emotion and human experience. We see fluid brushwork. It represents the general feeling surrounding the failure of the revolution and the return to a monarchy. A contemporary critic of the time said of this work, "We are all on the raft of the Medusa." Here's Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, which is another contemporary subject. It shows the fighting on the streets of Paris. Liberty here is an allegorical figure, much like the Statue of Liberty. She is this idea of freedom. So their goal during the revolution was to get rid of their conservative monarch and replace him with a more moderate one. So in the foreground, we see people who are dead and dying and wounded. There's people of all different classes fighting. We see a schoolboy on the right with 2 pistols, which shows the terrible cost of a revolution. It's not all about victory. There's an intense sacrifice here as well. Again, we are seeing diagonals in the raising of her arm and these kind of bayonets striking towards the front of the painting, which is an intense amount of energy. There's also fluid brushwork shown here. In Turner's The Slave Ship, upon first glance, you might think you see a beautiful, typical sunset, a nautical scene, maybe some rough waters. But as we zoom in, this is a terribly gruesome painting. So the full title of the painting is actually The Slave Ship, in parentheses, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. It accompanied a poem and depicts a real event, and unfortunately this wasn't necessarily an uncommon one. When a storm would hit, sometimes captains on slave ships would throw their slaves overboard to collect insurance money, because if the slaves died on board due to sickness or injury, they wouldn't get insurance money. It was only able to be collected if their slaves were, quote unquote, lost at sea. Realism was a movement where they were showing the subject matter of everyday life. There was this interest in empiricism, which is the search for knowledge based on observation and actual direct experience. So these artists were not avoiding the unpleasant aspects of everyday life. They were painting what they saw. In Courbet's The Stonebreakers, he is showing his concern for the plight of the poor. We see these stonebreakers on the side of the road in their tattered clothes. The color palette's very monotone. There's angular mechanical posing here with the older man. This is really back-breaking work. Courbet described the painting's origins in this quote. "Near Massert, I stopped to consider 2 men breaking stones on the highway. It's rare to meet the most complete expression of poverty, so an idea for a picture came to me on the spot. I made an appointment with them at my studio for the next day. On the one side is an old man, 70. On the other side is a young fellow, in his filthy, tattered shirt. Alas, in labor such as this, one's life begins that way, and it ends the same way." Manet's Olympia depicts a courtesan. The name Olympia was common for prostitutes in Paris at this time, in the 1860s. So here in this scene, we are in her apartment. She looks like a normal woman. She's not idealized, but she's looking right at us. This is very new. Her servant here is handing her flowers, presumably from one of her customers, but she must have just gotten them, right? It's as though we are in the room, but it also looks like we are the first ones in the room. If you look on the right, there's a cat who's startled, like as though someone just walked in the door. And Olympia is covering herself, looking right at us. This is kind of a vulgar statement, which was new in Paris at the time. Manet was essentially making us, as the viewer, the customer, as the people who just walked into the room. This was an appropriated image of Titian's Venus of Urbino. So you see the posing is very similar, and this was obviously a direct model for Manet's painting, but they're different, right? The Venus in Titian's painting is coy, whereas Olivia is firm. She has more power here. The setting, idealized versus real, right? Titian's Venus is in this lavish looking room, whereas Olympia is just kind of on a bed. You don't really get a sense of the space. It's not as illuminated here. There's also a difference in gaze. So Manet's Olympia is not removed from the viewer via time or place, but she is in the 1863 viewer's contemporary. She is very, very real. Impressionism depicted natural appearances of everyday objects and scenes, especially the way that light hit those objects and scenes. They utilized small dabs of paint to convey movement. So here you see in Claude Monet's Woman with a Parasol, she's in the bright sunlight, and there's thick dabs of paint that showcase the clouds, her dress in motion, and the wind swaying the grass. In Pissarro's The Boulevard Montmartre at night, it's blurry, right? It's this rainy, blurry scene. We can't really make it out from up close, but as we step further back, it comes into focus. Degas' The Star dancer on this stage, we see that there's no hard outlines or details. There's a lot of blending, right? All of the crowd and the audience is just kind of blended into these few tones, and the only really figure that we can make out is the dancer at the center of the composition. Monet's Impression Sunrise is a painting that's about capturing nature's fleeting moments. So something that was so imperative to this was that portable paint was now in existence. It was new. So painters could paint in plein air, meaning they could paint on the scene. They didn't have to replicate scenes in their studios or make sketches and then go back inside to paint them. But they could be depicting what they actually saw in real time outside. So here, Monet is depicting the fog, the mist, and the clouds as those things are changing in real time. Post-Impressionism was a response to Impressionism, in which there was a use of vivid, unnatural colors. There were still everyday scenes, but they were very exaggerated. There's not as much blending. Instead, there's very harsh outlines, but there is still that thick application of paint. So here we see Toulouse-Lautrec's painting, which utilizes those very heavy black outlines on all of the figures and elements of the environment. Gauguin's painting uses highly saturated colors. And Van Gogh's shows this thick application of paint, this impasto, right? You see paint for what it is. It's not being hidden by this desire to appear natural and very representational and realistic. Paint can exist as it is. Pointillism is a subcategory of post-impressionism. So pointillism is a type of technique for painting in which painters utilize tiny dots instead of something like Van Gogh's thick strokes. Seurat here used millions of tiny dots to display his Sunday afternoon on the island of Grand Jatte. Fauvism came from a French word, le fauve, meaning wild beasts. So here, these artists, Matisse and Derain, are using bold, very unnatural, saturated colors. They thought that color meant emotion. They're also very flat and very two-dimensional. Expressionism was also a response to Impressionism. They were interested in conveying emotion and meaning rather than reality. So they utilized things like extortion and exaggeration, these vivid, shocking colors. A lot of this art was immensely personal. A very famous example, Van Gogh's The Starry Night, right? He's depicting these sweeping winds rolling over the night sky in a very active way, a way that isn't how you actually would see this scene, but maybe how you would feel being a part of the scene. In Max Beckmann's The Night, we see these three men who appear to invade a small, cramped room, and they're kind of terrorizing this scene. So to the left, there's a man who's being hanged by one of the intruders, and his arm is being twisted by another one of the men. There's a woman, perhaps that man's wife, bound to one of the room's supports after having been raped. To the right, the child is about to be taken away by one of the intruders. So note the feet near the top right-hand corner. You can see that child's feet are he's lifted up, upside down. Egon Schiele's self-portrait shows this emaciated, tortured figure of the artist, bony and angular. It's very emotional. You get a sense of how Schiele was feeling about himself. Edvard Munch's The Scream also showcases this, blood red sky and these sweeping motions. In his diary, in an entry headed Nice, January 22nd, 1892, Munch wrote, "One evening I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked out over the fjord. The sun was setting and the clouds turning blood red. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream." Cubism, on the other hand, showed this breaking down or analysis of form. Here you see Pablo Picasso's Pigeon, or George Braque's Woman with a Guitar, right? You see the components, you can see the guitar strings, you can maybe see some of the facial features of the woman, but they're not compiled in a way that we're used to. We have to try to make sense of these fragmented parts. Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon shows this reversed gaze. So instead of us as the viewer staring at the posed in the portrait, these women are staring right back at us. Their faces were inspired by African and Oceanic masks, and these are actually 5 nude female prostitute models that Pablo Picasso hired for this painting. Futurism was all about showing movement. In Bala's Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, you can see this dog's little feet and tail and head moving along with the leash and the feet of the people who are walking him. You see those motions being documented. In Severini's Armored Train, we see this militarized car cutting through grass. There's smoke, there's gunfire, it's very active. Abstract Expressionism were non-representational paintings of thought and emotion. So paintings like Jackson Pollock, Autumn Rhythm, or Lee Krasner, Noon, or Mark Rothko's color field paintings, where color itself becomes the subject. In minimalism, 1950s to 1970s, we see this limited palette as well as a repetition of forms. Simple geometric forms and really primary and secondary colors. Dada happened kind of concurrently with minimalism, but it was very different. It was this movement that was about the whimsical and the nonsensical. It was the anarchist type of avant-garde art. So here's Marcel Duchamp's LHOOQ, which was a ready-made, meaning that he appropriated an already existing image. So not just the image of the Mona Lisa, but this is actually a postcard that he purchased. So he bought this postcard and then he drew a beard and a mustache on it and added a title. So the French pronunciation of the letters sounds like LHOOQ, which translates in French to "she has a hot ass." Surrealism was a movement that was more dreamlike, symbolic, and distorted. It showcases biomorphic shapes and these dreamlike scenes, very symbolic images, the persistence of memory. Right here you see these melting clocks. Also a lot of personal iconography and unexpected juxtapositions, so these bizarre assemblages of ordinary objects. And our interest here is really in seeing what's hidden, right? There's an apple that is covering this man's face, but that's where our attention goes. It's in the center of the painting. It's the most saturated object there in terms of color, but we can't see what's being hidden behind it, so that piques our interest. Pop art was designed for a mass audience. It really connected fine art with the masses. Jasper John's three flags, this typically charged patriotic symbol, is now deconstructed and repeated on top of itself, on top of itself, on top of itself. So it's really making this tremendous patriotic symbol is now just a commodification. It's just a thing. It's just shapes and colors that exist. Hockney's a bigger splash. We see modernist 1960s architecture in the background. Everyone in LA had a swimming pool, so it's this very flat, very precise geometric painting, but then the active gesture of the splash is shown, it's handled much differently with the paint. Roy Lichtenstein was inspired by comic strips. He called his paintings industrial. He utilized Ben-Day dots, which were a commercial printing technique like you see in newspapers, but here he's utilized them in a fine art piece. Photorealism is exactly what it sounds like. Reproduction of minute details with precision. So you see here a window for a cafeteria. You can see the reflections of the street in the glass as well as what's inside of the cafeteria. And the interior here in Ralph Going's diner, it looks like a photograph, right? It's the perspective, proportions, reflections, everything is expertly handled and very convincing. Then we get to contemporary art. So contemporary really started around the 1970s, but it's where we are now. And how do you define this? Recall from one of our first assignments, the reading by Danto, where he's saying that this line is no longer linear. Art history isn't linear. One thing doesn't lead to the next. It kind of, at this point, all just exists together. So here we see Jean-Michel Basquiat's Untitled painting. It's showing the inner versus the outer experience. There's abstraction and figuration in a way that we really hadn't seen before. Christopher Wool's Apocalypse Now was inspired by seeing graffiti on a new white truck, and it's black text on white. It's text-based art, which is very different than think about the medieval art, the religious art that we saw in the beginning. Takashi Murakami's Lots of Kakai and Kiki is super flat. So that's actually the type of painting that he characterizes his works as, super flat, which merges pop art and anime. It features these bold outlines and flat coloring, and there's this really decided lack of natural perspective, as well as depth and three-dimensionality. Here we see Banksy's Rage the Flower Thrower. So it's this man who's wearing riot gear and kind of in this pose where it looks like he should be heaving this Molotov cocktail, but really it's flowers. And the flowers are in the only color. So it's advocating peace. And this originally was put up in a high conflict area in Bethlehem. So it's making a political statement. So all of these pieces are treating painting so differently, and there's not really a common theme among them except perhaps experimentation and artist's voice. It's really, of course, paintings are still commissioned now, but a lot of fine art is just really what does the artist have to say, and are we interested in hearing it? So what I would like you all to do is to take a short quiz about this topic on Moodle by the end of class period today, 3 p.m., and then remember that your research paper is due this Sunday. Please feel free to send drafts to the Learning Commons if you would like some feedback, but make sure they are uploaded by midnight on Sunday to the Moodle. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.